You're watching HLN Now. I'm Yasmin V. New quarantine rules in New York, New Jersey, and Illinois order healthcare workers who've spent time in West Africa to undergo a 21-day quarantine. In New York, it can happen at home, but this has everybody talking, of course. Some of you weighed in on our Facebook page, and 94% of you say everyone, including healthcare workers coming from West Africa, should be quarantined for 21 days. So what do you think? We're talking about it this hour. Call us at 1-877-TELL-HLN. Dr. Devi, assistant professor at NYU School of Medicine, is back with us again. Dr. Devi, thanks for joining us. I'm obviously getting a lot of Facebook comments coming in, asking me questions about Ebola. And I got a tweet that literally just came in about 30 seconds ago, Dr. Devi, and I wanted to ask you that. What about toilet seats? If someone is infected with the Ebola virus, they sit on a toilet seat, some splash happens, someone else sits on the toilet seat, can you get the virus that way?
Well, I think in the healthcare setting, you might be able to if the person's critically ill and they have a lot of virus in their urine. If somebody doesn't have symptoms but they have Ebola, it's very low likelihood, even if they do have Ebola, because the thing is, you have to get an exchange of bodily fluids, so you've got to be able to get it actually into your system. And on top of that, there has to be enough virus in that urine or in that splash to be able to cause a problem.
I actually want to update you guys on some breaking news. We have an Army Major General and 10 other of his personnel that were in West Africa helping with the Ebola outbreak down there, who are being held in a controlled environment in Italy. They haven't shown any symptoms of the Ebola virus, but of course the Italian government is keeping them in a controlled environment for that 21-day incubation period. All right, Dr. Devi, we have a caller on the line, Joel from Florida. Joel, what are your thoughts on Ebola?
Just referring to the doctor in New York that was on the subway, do they have any idea how many hours or minutes before you get a fever you're infectious? I mean, if this guy sneezed and held onto a handrail and this stuff lets loose in the subway in New York, Africa's going to look small. It's absurd. And I respect all the healthcare workers that are going over there.
Right.
I think they should be honored. But I think they're the ones that should agree with this, that it's ridiculous not to be overabundance of caution. I really, I don't know if they can give me a straight answer how many minutes before you get a fever.
That's a great question, Joel. And Dr. Devi, you know, there's sort of a question about when it is that you become infectious. Because ultimately, I know when I get the flu, for instance, right, my fever begins to rise. So at what point am I infectious? At what point can I pass the disease on? Is it only when I have 104 fever, or is it when it's at 99?
Well, flu is a little bit different, so I think that spread more easily than Ebola itself. But I think, you know, you bring up a good point that we don't know that exact moment, you know, but we have to look at the evidence in the past. Now, people who have been sick in the past, like even Thomas Eric Duncan, you know, he went to the ER with symptoms. He stayed in his home with his family, even when he had symptoms and he had vomiting and diarrhea, but none of them got infected. So I think there is a period of time where even if a person has a fever or has some symptoms, they're not as contagious as or infectious as they might be later on when they're really very sick. But I think, you know, another really great point was brought up about why would healthcare workers oppose this in the first place. And, you know, interestingly, I was reading this piece by the nurse who was held in New Jersey, and it really wasn't about Ebola and how it spread. It was more about how she was treated when she arrived in New Jersey.
Right.
So I think that's the key there. You know, we want to talk to people. If you talk to healthcare workers and say, hey, you know, we know that you were risking your life to help other people. A lot has happened while you were away. Can we kind of get you up to speed on what's happening and tell you know what the public's concerns are? And if it's possible, can you voluntarily quarantine yourself in your home?
Right. And you have
and
it's important to strike that balance, I think, is what so many people are saying, in that there's the fear factor, but then there's also the factor that these doctors and these nurses are going abroad and helping quell the disease, helping fight the disease abroad, and we have to pay them that respect, but also pay the respect to the people that are fearful of getting Ebola, which is, you know, it's a very fine line to be on. All right, we also have another caller, William in Oregon. William, do you have any questions about Ebola?
Yes, I'm thinking the same thing. First of all, I'd like to say that I am very appreciative of people across this world that are willing to step into the front lines and try to get a grip on this terrible disease. But in the same point, I'm thinking they should not be opposed to being quarantined, because there is no magic answer as to how could a person be affected. I'm thinking if you volunteer to do this, in most cases, you should have no problem with setting aside just to make sure, because it is on our mind whether or not we can be affected, regardless of what they say.
Right. Yeah, William, and that's a great point. And Dr. Devi, that's not the first time that I've heard that. You know, we were just talking about it, and that, you know, there was a Facebook comment from Nancy. She says, it amazes me these people gladly donate time to save the people in other countries suffering with Ebola, but they don't want to donate 21 days to their own country to prevent others from getting it. But of course, the point that you just made about the nurse that was being quarantined in New Jersey was that it's not about her donating, you know, having 21 days of quarantine, but more about how she was treated.
Exactly, and I think the other thing is, remember, when these folks went over there was no quarantine here, so they're going to be surprised when they hear all this, especially when they first arrive here. And one other thing we could do is actually go to their organizations, the relief organizations, the ones they work for, and talk to them. I mean, I think if the relief organizations supported the idea, then it would be a different story, because as it is, with some of them, you know, the people already agreed to not go back to work for 21 days. So they already sign to some restrictions or agree to some restrictions, and then it's just a matter of making it more voluntary. Like, why not ask people, well, what would prevent you from doing the quarantine? Is it some concerns that you have about other responsibilities or obligations? You know, what else can we do to make this easier for you?
Right. All right. So much good information. More with Dr. Devi and your calls on Ebola. Call us at 1-877-TELL-HLN.
How do you get Ebola? Blood and bodily fluids such as saliva, semen, feces, and vomit. But you have to have direct contact. An open wound, unprotected sex, that sort of thing. Or you can get it from contaminated needles and syringes. That's why doctors and nurses who treat victims are more at risk. You won't get Ebola by breathing it in. It's not spread through air or through water, or for the most part by eating foods that's been contaminated. Those that handle the meat of wild animals in Africa may be at risk. But if you come in contact with the blood or bloody fluids of any infected animals, then you may get it. And there's this: you're not contagious unless showing symptoms. And that's the facts of Ebola.
Welcome back to HLN. We're talking about Ebola and the new rules, the new quarantine rules in both New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. Of course, joined by Dr. Devi, who is from NYU School of Medicine. Let's go straight to our first caller, Angel in Ohio. Angel, what are your questions about Ebola?
I just want to know how to prevent getting Ebola. Is there like a virus or like Lysol or bleach to work, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. Dr. Devi, you know, Angel wants to know, how is it that one can prevent themselves from getting Ebola if they are around someone possibly who was infected or who is infected?
Well, if you are really at risk, if you're a contact of someone who has Ebola, then yeah, you could use bleach, you can use alcohol to kill viruses, just any viruses. But for the most part, this isn't something that most people would come into contact with Ebola. You could use those things to kill any virus, so you might be able to protect yourself from the flu,
right?
And you know, things along those lines. But right now, there's no vaccine that you can use to protect yourself, but hopefully there will be one, you know, soon.
And I also think it's important for everyone to know the White House has actually released a statement saying that the CDC is going to have new guidelines for healthcare workers returning from West Africa later today. So, of course, we're going to be bringing you that information when we get it. All right, our next caller, Rebecca in West Virginia. Rebecca, what's your question about Ebola?
My question is, it's more a comment of the 21-day quarantine may be uncomfortable for some people, but nobody said the word epidemic or pandemic yet. And I was just wondering what's here and what are our chances of preventing something like that.
Of course. So, Dr. Devi, you know, of course, Rebecca is fearful of the spread of this disease. And so, you know, I think it's warranted knowing that it is in this country. So is there a chance that this could turn into an epidemic or a pandemic, as she mentioned?
Well, there's always a chance, right? But everything that we are doing, just as the community, is to try to prevent that from happening. So far, you know, there's been very isolated cases. And if you look at it, even with Thomas Eric Duncan coming here, you know, nobody around him, none of his contacts actually developed it. And similarly, with the nurses who got it, it was just sort of 2 nurses. It wasn't that it spread so quickly. So it seems like Ebola is very difficult to catch, in fact. Now, I think New Jersey and New York are enacting this quarantine because if it were to take hold in a place like New York City, then you would see a spread faster because there are so many people that travel in and out of New York and travel internationally. So I think they're trying to be proactive. It's not a situation where Ebola is taking a hold and now we have to do something. It's more preventative than anything else.
Right, absolutely. You know, I have a Facebook comment here that I want to read. It's from Carol. She says they should have a waiting period quarantined in West Africa before even boarding the plane. What are your thoughts on this, Dr. Devi?
You know, it's interesting that she mentioned that, because the thing is, there is a study that came out in The Lancet, which is one of our medical journals, and it suggests that maybe 2 to 3 people in West Africa will leave those countries with Ebola and potentially spread it. Now, that doesn't mean they're coming to the U.S., but they would try to leave that those countries without realizing it. So, you know, some people are arguing that there should be a quarantine in West Africa itself, but there's pros and cons to that. First of all, the U.S. doesn't have any legal authority to do that. That would actually have to be done there.
Right.
And second, you know, if you quarantine people there and they don't have Ebola, you have to have enough private rooms or whatever else. Like, it has to be voluntary still, but enough so that they wouldn't catch it from someone who has Ebola. You don't want to put a large group of people together and then see what happens. And they did try that already, and actually people got Ebola that way. So there was a lot of violence in West Africa as a result.
I want to take another caller. So Jay in Nevada. Jay, what's your question about Ebola?
Well, it's one of a comment. Ebola has been around since 1976 that I understand. That's one. Okay, so it's different strands. 2, we're not Africa, so we're not going to have the outbreak like Africa has. 3, if the politicians were to work on taking care of this properly and not using this as a political stepping stone to get votes in November, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Jay, I'm sorry I have to cut you off, Jay, but these are all such fantastic comments. Dr. Devi, thank you so much for your great information. We have much more coming up.